Good evening and a very warm welcome to the show that debates the hottest issue of the day. You're watching The Big Picture. The Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, or TRAI, has set new guidelines for 2G spectrum auctions after the Supreme Court directed it to come up with the same. TRAI has estimated the total value of auctions to touch 7 lakh crore rupees, an amount that is 7 times of what the government got in the scam-tainted 2G auctions under A. Rajya, the then telecom minister. The new guidelines have proposed a high reserve price for telecom spectrum to be auctioned at nearly 3,622 crore per megahertz in the 1800 megahertz band for GSM services. The reserve price of auction of spectrum is close to 10 times higher than what operators had paid in 2008. Interestingly, the base price for 3G spectrum was fixed at rupees 3,500 crore for 5 megahertz in 2010, which would make the recommended price 5 times higher than the 3G base price. The development may come as a blow to companies whose licenses were cancelled by the Supreme Court order and were looking at the auction to win them back. Industry is up in arms over the proposed recommendations as telcos issuing statements calling it a regressive regulatory step with condemnation uniform across the board. Tonight on The Big Picture, we discuss the TRAI recommendations in detail. We'll also try and find out whether these steps, if implemented, could prove to be regressive for the telecom industry in India. And of course, during the course of the show, we'll get around to whether this set of guidelines could potentially affect the consumers in case telcos end up raising tariffs. I'm Athar Khan, and joining me in the studio tonight, to my left, is Jagdish, Shettigar, senior leader of the BJP, Shalini, Singh, senior journalist, deputy editor with The Hindu, Prabhakar, former member TRAI. Also joining us on the program tonight is Mr. B.K. Singhal, CMD, former CMD of VSNL. Welcome to the show, everyone. I'd like to start off with Mr. Singhal, if I could. Mr. Singhal, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the proposed guidelines that TRAI has come up with, first thoughts on these guidelines. Do you agree with telcos when they say it's a retrograde and regressive step, regulatory step for the industry, or do you think that criticism is a bit too harsh?
I don't think the criticism is a bit too harsh or it's misplaced. First of all, I think in your introduction you mentioned about as a consequence or as a result of the Supreme Court judgment. I don't find anything referred to in these recommendations of TRAI relating to the Supreme Court judgment. I've got the judgment with me. The judgment talks about the spectrum allocation to licenses which were cancelled on 10/1/2008 and the spectrum which was quashed post 10/1/2008. Where is the treatment for those licenses? So therefore, to say that these recommendations or the regulations which have been released yesterday are as a result of the Supreme Court judgment. There is absolutely no treatment. As a matter of fact, I would even go to the extent to say that it's a complete bypass to the Supreme Court judgment and in no way related to that.
Right. If I could get Mr. Prabhakar into the conversation, do you agree with that? Does it go against the grain of the Supreme Court judgment, so to say? Do you agree with Mr. Singhal there?
Yes, I agree to the extent that what was required to be established was what roadmap should be given to the 122 licenses which have been cancelled. Now, it does not talk about how many slots should be auctioned. There are about 4 to 5 service providers of GSM technology in each service area. And if you don't auction 4 to 5 slots, may be available to everybody, then where is the level playing field? Some of them will definitely go out and they can see the intention of the Supreme Court has not been covered in these recommendations.
Right. So there you agree with Mr. Singhal there. Shalini, let me get you into the discussion here. Do you think it's unfair to the companies whose 2008 licenses were cancelled, like Sistema Sham, like Unitech Wireless? Do you think it's unfair to those companies and hasn't really helped them at all?
Well, why is it unfair? The entire allocation process was suspect. The Supreme Court has quashed it on grounds that it was opaque and illegal. So it's basically these companies, they had good intent, they wanted to stay the long haul, they've invested. I'm talking specifically about MTS and Unino. Right. But however, they bought stolen goods. So, one cannot express that much sympathy. They should have done their due diligence. They knew it was very much in the media that this was, not going the right way and there were underhand dealings. So they knew what was going on and they should have done their due diligence. So it's not in my place as a media person to express sympathy for the industry. They're big boys. They know what they're doing.
They
and
knew
they have
what
to
they were
take
getting into when they did it.
responsibility for their actions.
Right, right. Do you agree with Shalini and the rest of the panelists on this specific issue of how these companies might feel after this these recommendations?
Yeah, I feel it is a overreaction to the whatever the Supreme Court judgment came. And instantly this also justifies the what we call the loss due to the what we call the wrong allocation of the licenses or the so-called the scam of when you say that 1,75,000 crores worth. The government was contesting at that time. Now when the TRAI, when you said that about the 7 lakh.
7 lakh crore is the
7 lakh
estimated value,
crores.
yes.
7 lakh crores means that it instantly justified whatever the loss estimated by the CAG and all. Then the other issue is that ultimately it will affect the consumers. If the suppose some companies can afford and is able to pay the higher the reserve price and they get the license, ultimately they will pass on the burden to the consumer.
Absolutely.
So it is the consumer. Now again when it comes to the role of the TRAI is supposed to play the strike a balance between the service provider and the user.
Right.
Now how they will fix up the tariff now?
It's an interesting point you raised. We'll talk about tariffs and the potential threat of them rising. Let me get Shalini into the picture right now. The biggest issue that telcos seem to have with these new set of guidelines is the reserve price that has been increased. It's an unexpected rise. If my figures are correct, a minimum of 3,622 crore for every megahertz in the 1800 megahertz category. A pan-India spectrum will now cost a company 18,000 crores. Do you think the reserve price is unexpectedly high and it's obviously going to affect companies like we just mentioned, Uninor and System?
You see, it's not, again, I don't think it's in my place to debate the reserve price because, you know, the industry will always cry about higher prices.
And they've started.
Yes, but whether or not they bid eventually is something that they will have to figure out for themselves. So I don't want to get into a discussion on the reserve price, but I'd like to just answer that point that just came up about tariffs. There is no correlation between a bid amount and the tariffs. For instance, Vodafone bought out Hutch's stake in Hutch SR in 2007 for $11.2 billion. Tariffs didn't go up. But in 2G, when spectrum was given at a throwaway price of 1653 crores, a 2001 price, tariffs went up 30%. And now if you really look at it, you see 3G auctions, high bids, but tariffs, voice tariffs are lower than 2G tariffs. And TRAI chairman now, for this recommendation, has said that the spectrum costs are just a small fraction of the overall costs. Therefore, tariffs will not go up.
Right.
So where is the correlation with tariffs?
Right.
And this more or less vindicates our stand, with all the institutions, the CAG, media, activists, the Supreme Court, that there should have been auctions in the first place.
Let me put that question to Mr. Singhal, if I could, before I come to Mr. Prabhakar. Mr. Singhal, do you agree with Shalini when she says there is no real correlation between the capital-intensive bids that these companies will have to make once these auctions start and the raising of the tariffs? Do you agree with that, first of all?
I think I would go along with Shalini ji for the simple reason that what she's mentioned about the Vodafone purchase and consequent, as a matter of fact, leveling of tariffs, there is no relationship at all whatsoever. I would also say that the fixation of reserve price at such high levels, when we are going to determine the price through a market dynamic auction or market deciding the price of the spectrum, why should we fix it at such high levels when the market is to decide? Why give an opportunity to the industry to say, you got it wrong? They could have fixed the price by indexation or by other means and then let the market decide as to how to go along and what price to bid for.
But sir, the counter argument here seems to be, and what we're getting from different various quarters, is that the business models of the incumbents and new operators will have to be redrawn because they have to pay a higher price for spectrum. Do you not think that might influence their raising tariffs at all? Briefly, sir, if you could. We have to go into a break. Yeah, right now, sir. Go ahead.
You see, if you take the calculations on a simple EMI basis, the spectrum cost at the 2001 price comes to something like 70 crores for 4 licenses which were bid in 2001. And if you take the revenues today after 10 years when the industry has been in business against those licenses, the revenues are something like 12,000 to 15,000 crores a month. So, so it's not a question of tariffs really going up, it's a question that yes, there are margins, there is a market, and there are value-added services. There are many more services to be added.
Right, right.
So it's not a. You see, the point under discussion is that whether the bid price or whether the reserve price is too high. I would say yes, it is high in the sense when you are going in for an auction, a market determination. Why put a reserve price which is so high?
Right, right.
You could have indexed it to maybe 2001 price and then put it around 6, 7.
Point taken, Mr. Singhal. We'll go into a short break right now. We'll come back and discuss the nitty-gritty, some more guidelines that have come out. We'll discuss them one by one. Don't go anywhere. Stay tuned. Keep watching The Big Picture. Welcome back. You're still watching The Big Picture, and we're still discussing the new set of guidelines that TRAI has come up with for 2G spectrum allocation and auctions. Coming to you, Mr. Prabhakar, there is this talk of this refarming proposal that is part of the guidelines. Now, if TRAI's proposal to refarm the 900 megahertz band is accepted, keep in mind this is not binding on the government right now. Vodafone, Bharti Idea, the big players, the big major players, will have to shell out a cumulative amount of 95,000 crores to buy back the spectrum they already own. Now, they're not going to like that, are they?
See, that is a very important aspect to be considered is we have fixed the reserve price even higher than the 3G. Now, let us see.
It's 5 times the price of 3G, apparently.
It's 5 times.
Yeah.
Now, let us see, even though they have taken a progressive step of a slot of 5 megahertz, but what we have to see is in this 1800 megahertz band, what is available is either 2G voice services or LTE, which is a high data services. Now, LTE doesn't have a basic voice requirement, while at present the need of the hour is voice services. Therefore, we have to concentrate on voice services, and 3G is not available in 1800 megahertz. Once this is not available, the 1800 megahertz price itself looks to be very high. Let us take the example of 3G. The price, base price fixed was low, but the industry found the value to be very high. They had gone for that one. So the one course of action could have been that assuming it at par with 3G, you could have fixed the 3G auction price as a base price and then gone for auction. Based on that one, it is definitely there 900 megahertz has got much better transmission characteristics and much better accuracy. Then based on those prices, we could have said, all right, twice that price should have been taken as a reference instead of guiding at this stage.
Right. Shalini, let me ask you this. Notwithstanding the flack that the new set of guidelines have gotten in just one day, there is a silver lining, so to say. Now, the proposed guidelines suggest that only 1/3 of the entire bid amount should be paid upfront, and then they have around 12 years, a period of 12 years to pay the rest. Now, this would reduce the capital intensity of telecom operations. Won't that give telcos under financial stress a bit of some breathing room? Isn't that slightly good for those companies who are under financial stress right now?
I think these are issues which are going to be debated over the next few days. I'm not really sure whether the staggered payment mode has really proved to be all that productive in the past, you know, because then they say we can't pay and they, you know, cook up all sorts of excuses. So eventually they end up just paying the minimum amount. There have been such cases in the past. So I'm not, you know, I have my reservations on that.
Right.
Good for them, but is it really good for the nation?
Right, right. That's a very important question that you asked. Is it good for the nation? Good. It might be good for the telecom companies, but it's debatable whether it's good for the
industry. And we have a budgetary
also.
Target. Please don't forget. I think the finance minister has said that he wants 40,000 crores from this auction.
Yeah.
So if you're going to do this, how do you meet your fiscal targets?
Right, right. That's another question that I'll ask you a little bit later in the program. Let's get Mr. Shettigar's views on this. Do you think sort of it liberalizes spectrum, as some would say, paying only the one-third bid amount upfront, then they have 12 years to pay the rest? Do you think it's obviously good for the telcos, like Shalini said, but do you think it's the right move if it's accepted, first of all?
No, before that, I'm responding. I would just want to react to what exactly we are debating. Now, if as the Singhal or the Shalini has pointed out that there is no link with the tariff, I mean, we should be happy if the government gets more revenue. So what we are debating, and if the government is fixing the higher prices, why should we be concerned? The government gets getting the 7 lakh, or even if it gets 14 lakhs, after all it goes to the exchequer, it will be utilized for the benefit of the country. We should be happy of that.
Right.
But real worry is that its impact, but what stage or how, what rate the service provider will pass on to the consumer, it depends on his business strategy and the model. But when somebody invests the money, it is, after all, it's a cost of the business. I would like to look, no businessman is there in the, on a charity basis. Right. You would recover that. What phase you would recover, but ultimately will pass on to the consumer. How can you say that it has no relationship with the tariff?
Right, that's a very important point. Let me come to Mr. Singhal and ask you this. It's still debatable. Do you think it's still debatable whether there's a correlation between raising tariffs and these new recommendations? That's my first question. Another question, sir. Another criticism of these guidelines that has come about is that if these recommendations are accepted, it is entirely possible that no single telecom operator might not just get any license during this year, especially after June, which is when the telecom licenses that were cancelled, that comes into play. An editorial page in one of the business papers today even said that the Competition Commission of India should take suo motu cognizance of the matter and take up this issue. Do you think there's any need for that? Do you think it's that grave, the situation?
The situation is very grave. As a matter of fact, I think today's Supreme Court judgment has given some relief in the sense that it's not 2nd June anymore, it's 31st of August, and the cancellation of license would be on 7th of September. I think that's a very good relief which some of the operators have got. There are a couple of points which I would like to make on the refarming. This is not refarming of 900 megahertz, it's basically an eviction. Refarming is a process by which you get a new spectrum into the play and then use it for new technologies. You see, technology is not static, and it is now at such a fast pace that you think of something today and it is kind of sell by date over. It's the way 900 megahertz now is being refarmed, I will not call it refarming. It is an eviction of incumbents from 900 for someone else's convenience, and then giving them spectrum into 1800 with little disregard to what Mr. Prabhakar alluded to earlier. The voice services are the predominant services today. So therefore, first of all, refarming is, the way it is completely misplaced, and the reserve price for that, let's not discuss. This is something which is completely wrong.
Right.
The second point about tariffs and the spectrum cost, yes, indeed, there is a relationship. We are not saying that there is no relationship, but as I mentioned earlier, the revenues which today the companies are earning out of a sunk cost for 20 years in 2001 are many times more. So the business cases can be looked into and see what is the percentage increase which has taken place in the spectrum.
Right.
And with the volumes, with high-end services, which may partially offset the investments of the operators.
Right, Mr. Singhal.
The impact may be much less.
Right, Mr. Singhal. We'll take another short break right now. We'll come back and discuss a couple of other issues that I have in front of me and, of course, need to be discussed in relation to this new set of guidelines that TRAI has come out with for the 2G spectrum allocation. Don't go anywhere. We have lots more to come on The Big Picture. Stay tuned. back. You're still watching the big picture. Mr. Prabhakar, if I could get you in, no doubt the revenue generated by these fresh auctions, if they are accepted by the government, remember they're not binding right now, the government can reject it if they want, it will ease the government's fiscal troubles. And Mr. Pranab Mukherjee, the finance minister, has been very keen on getting whatever he can milk out of these auctions now. That would also potentially impact private investment on the other hand. Don't you think that would be like taking one step forward and three backwards? Even if they do get the money they want to ease them out of their fiscal troubles, private investment will be harmed. Don't you think that's going to happen?
Yes, it will. But this TRAI recommendation of 33% of amount to be paid one, perhaps may little ease the investment climate. But if the government decides otherwise to take upfront that much amount, if the industry takes, and let us say it gets the money, then the amount of interest which has to be paid on this amount and revenue generation will take time. To that extent, it will impact the tariff. So government will have to now strike a balance that telecom is a very, very important industry at this stage.
It's the backbone of economic...
and the data services have to pick up very fast at an affordable price. At present, 3G data services are at a very high price. And unless they are brought at an affordable price, the data service, they don't pick up, the real economic development will not take place. Therefore, the government has to now take a call on this one.
The ball firmly in the government's court. Shalini, you want to make a point? Also, if I could ask you another question after that, go ahead, make a point.
Well, basically, when you ask about investor sentiment, the biggest thing spooking the investor, whether it's a domestic investor or it's the global investor, is the fact that at the highest levels of policy making, whether it's a TRAI the TRAI, which is the telecom regulator, or the minister or the secretary, how they change their stand and their logic and rationale between Monday and Tuesday. In May, 11 May 2010, the same regulator made a case for not auctioning 2G spectrum. Now he not only auctions it, but he sets a high reserve price. There have been affidavits filed in the court by the telecom minister and the DOT, and he's given, speeches about teledensity and public interest and affordability and why tariffs have to be kept low, and that's why, price spectrum has to be given away for a song. Now suddenly they're saying the reserve price is not high, this is great, it's wonderful, and by the way, the TRAI chairman also said it's just a fraction of the overall cost, so it doesn't impact tariffs. So between Monday and Tuesday, before the Supreme Court judgment and after the Supreme Court judgment, I mean, policymakers and government are singing a completely different tune.
It's a classic
How does it
flip-flop,
add up? Yeah, how does it add up? So one day you'll give first come, first serve and defend that logic to your grave, and the next day you'll be singing another song. Now, what does it tell the investor? All I can say is that the stand that, the media, activists, and the Supreme Court has been taking since 2007 against, in favor of transparency and auctions has been vindicated entirely by this TRAI recommendation. So that's the silver lining. That at least, we've been making sense all these years.
So do you agree that private investment obviously will get affected? And do you think that the government, like Shalini said, classic case of flip-flop again?
Yeah, that is why in the beginning itself I said that is a overreaction to the Supreme Court judgment commenting on the government's decision to, rather it is not the first come, it is a distorting the first come basis. Definitely it will affect the investment sentiment, and especially when a sector which is seen as a sunrise segment of the economy. And the government is actually adversely affecting this thing. Now, apart from that, we should not see this what we call the so-called cost in isolation. We should also see it in the point of the opportunity cost also. After all, then when it comes to the infrastructure, in this case, it is the communication. Communication revolution, played a major role in the economic development. So we have seen how even let alone the higher end of the society, even the lower segment of the society also got the benefit. Now, when it comes to the spectrum use, we should look from that angle in what way it is affecting the different sections of people. So should seen in the overall approach should be not in isolation or the telecom or the spectrum
fair point.
per se.
Fair point. Let me go to Mr. Singhal quickly. Sir, briefly, sir, if you could, I'll ask you the same question I asked my panelists in the studio. No doubt the revenue generated by these auctions, if the estimate of TRAI is correct, that's about 7 times what they got last time. They'll get the windfall they're expecting, but do you think because private investment might be impacted and private investors might shy away because of these regulatory hurdles, if I want to call them that, do you think that'll be a step in the right direction and 2 steps in the wrong direction? Do you agree with that? Briefly, sir, if you could.
I think what has been done is a catalogue of errors. First flawed recommendation was 2007 when they said no auction. Then there are also a catalogue of misinformation and also, I would say, economical with the truth, saying that the first come first served policies were of NDA government, and before that there has not been even one single license with spectrum which has been given on a first come first served basis until 2008, 10th January 2008. I want to clear that misconception first.
Right.
Never ever since 1993 no license with spectrum has been given on first come first served basis. They have been either on bidding or against auctions,
right,
which is a market determination.
Right.
I think this point of the government has got to be clearly established, and this misinformation has got to be rectified.
Right, right.
Now, what the TRA, this regulation has done is, you made a catalogue of errors, 2007, 2010. Now you suddenly corrected with a 7 lakh crore
estimate
of a mirage or a Maya. I mean, this should have been left to the markets to decide what should be the price for
Right, sir. We are almost out of time. 2 quick words. First, Mr. Prabhakar, do you want to respond to that? And I'll give the last word to
I
Shalini.
just want to respond that first come first served policy has been followed. After 2003, Migratory and Unified Access Service license, there have been licenses given till 2006. And those licenses were the people have applied as a course of action as mentioned in the guidelines, and the application which was received first was dealt almost within the same 1 month period and have been given. So Mr. Singhal, I would like to marginally correct. There have been licenses given after 2003 to this one on first come first policy. Only in 2008 this first come first served policy was twisted,
right,
which created a what you call a distrust among the people,
right,
and had brought the whole industry to this stage.
Point taken. So last word on the show must go to Shalini. Shalini, like Mr. Singhal said, it's a catalogue of errors. The ball now firmly in the government's court. Do you think these recommendations will pass muster? Will the government see what my panelists tonight have pointed out? What do you think?
Well, I think I would support Mr. Singhal that the way the telecom sector, which was India's best performing sector, the way it's been treated in the past few years, it almost appears that it's no longer about corruption, illegality, and opaque procedures. It's now becoming a huge issue about competence. And do they have the competence to pull the sector out of the mess that Mr. Rajya has pulled it into?
Right. Fair point. Important question that you've raised. We have to end there. We are almost out of time. Thank you very much, all my guests joining us. Mr. Prabhakar, Shalini Singh, Mr. Shettigar. Thank you, Mr. Singhal, for joining us on the show tonight. That's all we have from the studio tonight. Of course, the ball firmly now in the government's court. It'll take its time in examining these recommendations before they take any step. That's all we have from the Big Picture tonight. Till next time, when we get you another edition of the Big Picture from the studios. Goodbye, good night, and thanks for watching.